welcome everybody to this session of the Emmaus Road. I want to just open with a reading, and the reading is taken from the work The Divine Providence, number 281, subsection 2. It's a lengthy paragraph, so just bear with it. It contains a lot of information about the regenerative process, but I think it's well worth just spending some time with that. So we'll just get underway with that. Siri, I know you're watching. You've just posted a test question, and that question has arrived here, so that's great. I won't be responding. Well, I can't actually respond to questions via text. I have to respond to them verbally. So that's just so you're aware of that. So just let me share the screen, and so that you can read along with this reading with me. All right, won't be a sec. All right, so yes, Divine Providence 281, and starting in subsection 2. Every man is from birth in evils of many kinds. These evils are in his will, and whatever is in the will is loved. For that which a man wills from the interior he loves, and that which he loves he wills. And the will's love flows into the understanding, and makes its delight to be felt therein. And from that it comes into the thoughts, and also into the intentions. If, therefore, man were not permitted to think in accordance with his will's love, which is implanted in him by inheritance, that love would remain shut in, and would never be seen by him. And a love of evil that is not seen is like an enemy in ambush, like matter in an ulcer, like poison in the blood, or corruption in the breast, which, if they are kept shut in, induce death. But on the other hand, if man is permitted to think about the evils of his life's love, even so far as to intend them, they can be cured by spiritual means, as diseases are by natural means. What a man would be if he were not permitted to think in accordance with the delights of his life's love shall now be told. He would no longer be a man. His two faculties, called liberty and rationality, in which the essential humanity consists, would be destroyed. The delights of these evils would occupy the interiors of his mind, even to the extent that the door would be closed, and in that case he could speak and act only in accordance with those delights. Thus he would act insanely, not only in his own sight, but also before the world, and at last he would not know enough to cover his shame. But that he may not become such, he is indeed permitted to think about and to will the evils of his inherited nature, but not to talk about and do them. And in the meantime he learns civil, moral, and spiritual things, and these also enter into his thoughts and remove the insanities, and by means of this knowledge he is healed by the Lord, and yet no further than to know how to guard the door, unless he also acknowledges God and implores his help, that he may be able to resist the insanities. Then, so far as he resists them, so far he refuses them admittance into his intentions, and finally into his thoughts. Since then man is free to think as he pleases, to the end that his life's love may come forth from its lurking places into the light of his understanding, and since otherwise he would know nothing about his evil, and therefore would not shun it, it follows that the evil would so grow in him that no spot for restoration would be left in him, and scarcely any in his children if he should beget any, for the parent's evil is transmitted to the offspring, but the Lord provides that this shall not take place. Okay, well, welcome, Stephanie. Yeah, so I think it's a great reading. It just sort of sets a bit of context for us in the light of the sermon, and particularly in the light of the ideas of anxiety and depression, of course, which something that is a part of the spiritual life for many people. Perhaps not all people, but certainly for many, this is a very real experience. And the hope is that in gaining a bit of an understanding of what sits behind these experiences, we might be able to better manage them if they do sort of encroach on our life. So I think just running through a couple of points. The idea that the self is a multiplicity, that we feel that we're an autonomous self, but in actual fact, what's revealed through the heavenly doctrine is that this is an appearance, and that there's an incredibly complex network of spiritual associations that sits behind our every move. In fact, when you, or if you ever get a chance to explore Swedenborg's spiritual diary, he talks about right down to things as what we would consider as insignificant as perhaps the blinking of an eyelid has spirits involved, and there's nothing we can, everything we do has to have this link to the very source of life, which is the Lord. And because the Lord can't be with us directly as he is in himself, that life has to be moderated in some way, and the way that it's moderated in terms of our own sense of self is through the agency of angels and spirits out of the hell. So this is just something that is stated, but there are ways of testing this for ourselves, and we might talk about those a little later. So with those things in mind, I just want to perhaps just open things up to the panel, just to initially share their reflections and thoughts on what they've listened to or read in the sermon that was offered as the precursor for this event. So let's get underway just with your comments and questions, and I might just start with, I'll start with you, Gray.
Wow. Well, there were so many nice little points. I have my pages numbered here, so I guess this would be about 1/3 the way through, where it says spiritual work is not about maintaining a sense of well-being. It is about acquiring a being that is well, in the sense of being whole. The point is that a sense of well-being isn't necessarily an indication of being well or whole, spiritually speaking. And I just, I love being reminded of something like that, because I think probably there's, the initial motivation is to feel better, and that this whole sermon was bringing up that that's not the point. And I just can't be reminded of that too often. And something that struck me a couple of pages further, where the spirits from hell are present in man's bodily and worldly loves, and the angels from heaven in those which are celestial and spiritual. For without the spirits, the person can have no life at all. If the spirits were taken away from him, he would drop dead as a stone. Now, I think what we're reading from here is Arcana 10:4-8-3. Consequently, to enable a person to lead a life in keeping with his loves, the hells are opened of necessity and as need demands, and from there such spirits come out to him who are ruled by love similar to his. The whole thing was an ironic comfort of just thinking, with the image of the mercy of the Lord, that the hells are opened of necessity so that our loves can breathe. And this whole, what you read at the beginning, it's only by seeing them that there's any hope. And whereas I think the way I used to look at spiritual life, it was also terrifying. And so now there can be a bit of a sense of almost, oh, goody, this means there's another layer to go through, which, looking always for some indication of progress. And anyway, those were things that I could go on, but that's just yeah. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thanks, Gray. So I might go to you next, Stan.
Yes. I was told when I was quite young, and I'm sure it's common knowledge, that we are only using 10% of our abilities, or we perceive perhaps only 5% of the sensations. And our minds, in a sense, are filters as much as viewers. They're windows, but they're also tinted windows. And it's like, I think in your sermon you talked about how we have to have the light moderated so it doesn't blind us. If we see God, it's been said, I'm not sure if it's biblical, if we see God we die. And it's like it's too much for us. We have to have it. It's like fertilizer that's too strong for the plants. It needs to be watered down a bit, otherwise it can overwhelm the roots or overwhelm the organism. Yeah, that's enough for now.
Thanks, Stan. Elizabeth?
One of the things I thought of in the growth, that it needs to occur slowly, but it seemed to me that sometimes it occurs in spurts, so that sometimes it's very slow and sometimes, well, it seems to be fast because you're sort of jumping to the next level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, carry on.
And I liked Gray's mercy of the Lord, that he forgives us for our wrongdoings, and he's always ready there. If we make the slightest step towards him, the Lord comes to meet us. And that going from one level to the next can be very exciting. It can be.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Steph?
Can I say that Einstein said that, go back to Elizabeth. We'll compare Einstein and Elizabeth. They're pretty similar, both mathematicians. Einstein said that 2 minutes on a hot stove seems too long, 2 minutes with your lover or friend seems too little. So spurts, are they short, are they fast, are they long-lived, depends on where you're at. So it's very internal and personal.
Nice. Thanks for that. Steph?
I think Steph's muted.
Hello. I'm sorry. I muted it?
No, you're good.
Wait.
You're mute now. You're still muted, Steph. Yeah.
Wait, am I muted now?
You're good. You're good now. You're good now. Okay, start from the top.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I just thank you so much for this sermon. Really fascinating. Some things that stood out were from AC 9334. And and it was talking about the deficiency of truth and good, and what Stan and Elizabeth were talking about, that regeneration is not hurried but takes place slowly, and then reading on that the next page. If the removal were done suddenly, the person would pass out, for the whole network of things, every single one, would be thrown into confusion and deprive him of his life. And I guess I feel like that happens sometimes. I mean, I feel like I experienced that personally, which it really struck me, because it's. So I'm kind of just curious that it seems like sometimes that whole understanding, that whole network of everything you understand it does happen too quickly. So I wanted to ask you about that. And I also loved the part in Conjugal Love. I have it here. 361, talking about when a love is attacked, it defends itself. I think essentially from zeal, and I thought that was really neat, just to think about the whole, that it's not just you, it's this whole community of spirits, and I understood it as angels, that it was a good love, but I was kind of confused, because when you went on, it sort of sounded like, oh no, those are like evil loves, that that whole community of evil spirits is dying, and that's why we resist it. But I was wondering if that went the other way as well, if it's like a good love is being attacked, in the world, if it's hurting the community of angels as well. That's what I first understood it as. And then I also just wanted to ask you about, I found this very enlightening about depression and anxiety, but I was wondering about ongoing depression. Is that a spiritual experience? There are a lot of people that have long-term depression, and so I just was wondering if it's just constantly a spiritual battle, or anyway, I kind of love a praxis about what's just a lot of painful living and dysfunctional living versus being allowed to see it. I don't know, but anyway, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so some good points, some interesting questions. So I'm just happy to work with some of those, but firstly, I'd just like to ask the panel just to respond to what they've heard from others, if they have any thoughts or insights they would just like to add. To do that now, you can come in at any time.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
One thing I thought of from the reading, the sense of self is the container, so we can actually allow things to come into us, and we choose that. And also, it seems to me it's what you focus on. If you focus on the negative, you do end up depressed. As I was thinking of, who was the last speaker?
Stephanie.
Stephanie, sorry. What Stephanie said, it's a matter of focusing on the negative. I think if you focus on the negative, you end up really being depressed in the long term. And the Lord does help you to focus on the good. You just open yourself to Him. Hopefully that's helpful.
The way I see it is that if you try to lift a weight that's beyond you, you're overwhelmed, If you get help to lift the weight, then you're not so overwhelmed. You can even enjoy the task of lifting the heavy load. But doing it on your own is the essence of mental illness. I have spent much of my life studying and working with mental illness, and one of the ingredients of depression is trying to do it by yourself. And one of the answers to depression is getting people in contact with other people so that they feel connected with society. And I understand in a Swedenborg sense, being connected with other people, with the good in other people, is like being connected with the angels, and that's where the help comes.
Which is where the community of angels, community and the community of evils, it's living in community all the time, spiritually, and hopefully through the community of good.
I thank Stephanie for bringing up this distinction between the introductory remarks that say this is depression and anxiety as it relates to states that arise from the ongoing work of self-examination and repentance, and the impact that that has on the structure of our sense of self, and that in reading through the sermon, I kept my focus with that caveat, because yeah, it seems like depression and anxiety can just be caused by other things, and it was fascinating to me to be just thinking in terms of what comes up in response to truths being brought into my mind, you know, where as far as lifting the stones or whatever, so much it seems to me that it's more putting on the safety belt for the rough ride of what's going to be seen, you know, that rather than logopraxis has taught me to not rupture so much by trying to lift things that are none of my business, and to make the distinction between well, I just noticed that so often in the Word it's talking about what the Lord is doing, and I take it on as something I'm supposed to be doing, and that's when it gets really too heavy. And what struck me too about well, the idea that growth is slow, but sometimes in spurts, and then Stephanie saying having the experience, this is happening too quickly, and it strikes me that excuse me, something's happening with my computer here. There we go. That what logopraxis is teaching me is that when it feels like it's happening too quickly, it reminds me of like when a baby is being born. On the one hand, it's a big experience, and let's get this over as fast as possible. But I've also had the experience, this is way too fast. You know, and it's scary. But to trust that if it's happening, that the Lord okayed it, and that what it's saying is that too quickly means it's not going to be in our experience, that we're just protected that way. And just because it's so fast that we hate it, it doesn't mean that it's too quickly. You know, it just means that that's the experience. Well, I get there somewhere in the sermon it talks about things that support our spiritual life change over time, and sometimes when there's a breakdown of what has been supportive, it can feel like no, it's happening too fast. But the teachings that this is all under the Lord's government gives me a security that what, no matter how I feel emotionally or what have you, that there's the reassurance that it's the Lord's timing, not mine. He's not going to wait till it all feels comfy to me. because that's not going to serve the end of humility, I guess. Thanks.
Thanks, Gray. Yeah, so yeah, that's great. Yeah, the caveat was there at the start. It was deliberately put there to try and separate out general aspects of anxiety and depression in the general population, which does seem to be becoming more and more of an epidemic, really, or getting to epidemic proportions, particularly in the West. To separate that from the actual states that arise as a result of self-examination, introspection, that kind of spiritual work, where we're confronted with really having our self-image broken down. That's really what's happening there. There's another aspect I'll touch on a little later, but I think it's in terms of general states of anxiety and depression, everything else has to be ruled out. I think you know, there are definitely aspects that relate to physiological abnormalities that can lead to those sorts of states, and then there is general disordered living that can, so just taking it up a little bit higher there. Or a bit more inward is probably a better term to use, where you know, we're just living a life which is could be in contradiction to our professed values, or so there's a whole raft of things. It's a complex area. But the interesting thing about it is that you know, what is known in terms of the building of neural networks. So just bringing it back to that aspect. So on a very sort of like on a physical level, on the level of physiology, you know, once neural pathways are established and which correspond to certain behaviors, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of feeling, the more that those aspects dominate our mental life, the stronger those pathways become in terms of their prominence in terms of their activation within our mind. So that can be observed from a you know, through instrumentation and scientific analysis and things like that. But it doesn't mean that is the cause. You know, in one sense, I think we talk about psychosomatic illness, and really all that means is that that consciousness is in the first place, and the physical aspect is in the second. So what we see in the physical is a mirror of what's happening on the level of the mind, and this is something that the writings emphasize a lot, that all causes are spiritual. Let's see, hang on.
I like the way you said physical being a mirror of the mind, and that they're all connected.
Yeah, that's right. So I see your back step.
That's bad connection.
Okay. We broke off. So hopefully, I'm just waiting for Gray to get back now. So yeah. So what we so I'll just cover off a bit with what we spoke about when Gray was with us. So that was the idea that Elizabeth has just brought up, which is the idea or responded to, as the idea that what's happening on a physiological level has a spiritual component. It has so in that sense they can't be really separated. Although when you're talking about correspondences as such, there can be states on a physical level that ground spiritual influences. So if we work at the level of our physiology and things are manipulated at that level, then states can be produced. But it's not the manipulation that causes the state. States are fully present always, but we are only, as Stan sort of pointed out a lot earlier in the piece, that what we are able to sense is a very small portion of the sensory information that's coming in at any particular time. So we're filtering all the time. Well, that's true for what's passing from internal to external. But if we manipulate those exterior states, or at a physiological level, if we manipulate things, state of a physiology, then certain mental states can present themselves. Now, it's not that the physiology has caused the mental state. The mental state is there. What's happened is that what's happened at a physiological level has actually grounded and filtered and given access to, in terms of our own experience, to that mental state. So all causes are spiritual. Everything that takes place on a natural level are effects. That's a principle that we work from. It is, in terms of general states of anxiety and depression, those, as I said before, they're complex states, but they will also be linked to spiritual influence. Although the person mightn't have a belief in that level of existence, and therefore they are limited just to physiological, physical interventions, that level of working. If a person perhaps who suffers from those states then starts spiritual work, then that's a different kettle of fish, if you like. So what starts to happen there is that you're beginning to confront those kinds of states in a way that you hadn't confronted them before. So and acquiring new tools with which to deal with them, or to at least understand them, or to come into an understanding of them that makes them manageable, more manageable than they were without that understanding. So yeah, does that kind of cover things off in that area, Steph?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Okay.
I like the way you said we gain new tools. That's sort of a learning process that the Lord gives us.
Exactly right.
Learn.
Yeah.
You were saying, David, that the spiritual states don't come from the physical. How would you say, when you walk through a forest or a beautiful garden, or a man sees a beautiful woman, or maybe a woman sees a handsome man like me, something happens? Yep. Is that not the physical influencing the spiritual? Okay, so that's it's a great question, great point. So the way to look at it is with all these sorts of questions as to which comes first, it's helpful to go back to first principles. And if you go back to first principles, I'm talking about spiritual principles here now. So if you go back to a first principle, which is that the Lord is omnipresent. So that's an axiomatic truth, if you like. It just is. Now, we don't always perceive in our experience that the Lord is always present, but that doesn't change the truth that He is. And then maybe I'm reading a scripture or I'm reading a passage from the Heavenly Doctrine, and suddenly there's an experience of something higher sensed breaking through into the more exterior. Now, it's not that the Lord wasn't there and hasn't been there all the time. What it is that the actual contact with the text has allowed for something to be sensed that wasn't being sensed before. So the same principle applies in the examples that you gave, Stan. There is a constant flow of what is of a spiritual nature looking to be grounded.
And when we encounter something on a physical level, that state is then grounded. And so it's correlated, but it's not causal. So the actual external event appears to have caused the thing because we didn't see it before until we came into contact with that external event. But what has actually happened is that the external event has just allowed for the tuning in of something that is already present, and that is what we're experiencing. So the principle is that what is less fine cannot pass into, sorry, what is less fine can't pass into what is finer. That would be what would be termed in the writings as physical influx, where something physical can pass into the spiritual. That is stated to be an impossibility. That always the higher is passing into the lower. So what is finer passes into what is less fine, and that's where we experience it. So I hope that kind of helps.
And that clarifies well.
This idea of new tools, thinking about the main point, I think it's the main point of the sermon, that it is a tool to think in terms of that I'm not operating autonomously. It's a tool to separate how I feel about something, or I want it this way, I want it that way, that isn't me that's doing the wanting, it's the associate spirits. And I find that it's nearly impossible for me to hold that thought, which tells me how much in it I am. But it's a tool that begins as a concept to apply, and maybe that's what our tasks are in Logo Praxis every time, in a way, is we're picking out a tool to use for the session and to pay attention, to keep it sharp, and to actually, talking about crowbars earlier, to use this crowbar to experience the dynamic differently. And it's interesting that some truths seem to be easy to remember and apply, and this one for me is really, really hard. It's not hard for me to get my head around it conceptually. It's really hard to remember in an active state. And do you have anything to say about little helper there, David, or anyone?
Yeah, look, it's great. I mean, what we're seeing there is the power of appearances over what truths teach. So, at the level of our senses, it appears like when I when I come into contact with whatever it is, when I'm walking through the forest and suddenly, I experience this epiphany, that forest has, or that environment has created that inner state. Or when I get into a very difficult situation, when I come into contact with somebody that I have difficulty with, then perhaps all this negative stuff starts to arise, and I immediately attribute the inner state. I project it so that the person before me is the cause of it. That's how my lower mind works. It's wanting to pass off the responsibility to have to actually work with and deal with what's arising within me, and negate that responsibility by saying that, well, that person is the cause, and if I can get rid of that person, then everything will be okay. And of course, what that extends to, if we take the Ten Commandments, it extends to a spiritual form of murder, where what is uncomfortable for me I begin to project out onto others and want them done away with, so that I can keep a state that I'm content with or happy with. Whereas if we just saw that that this particular person, and this is a difficult thing to do, that this particular person is really a gift under providence, in order that I might see something that is present within me that without that grounding I wouldn't see, which comes back to our opening reading. So the Lord undertakes to offer many situations, moment to moment, on a daily basis, whereby we can come to see what is present within, and take responsibility for it, and begin to apply truths as the means of having these things worked through. So, yeah, I'll leave it there. I think that's.
It's interesting that I think it was said that we project onto others the evils that are in us. And so that makes me wonder, is there any such thing as evil outside ourselves? And maybe, would you like to speak to that? It's not all in us.
Great question.
I'm pretty bad, but can't be all my fault.
So
that leads to depression.
So the I think one thing that inner work does is that it brings us into contact with the idea that, you know, as much as our self is a multiplicity, if we just extend that a little bit, abstract that a little bit more, and we talk about the proprium. Now, the proprium that I call my proprium, the one that I'm in contact with, is that multiplicity. So evil just takes a particular form in a particular mind, a particular form of the mind, and they're, you know, and those evils are expressed as they are within me. The evils that I carry are expressed in a particular way, which may be different from how somebody else experiences the evils that are within their sphere of perception, if you like. But over time, through you know, doing the work of observing, of self-examination, you begin to see that, you know, the hells aren't really that bright. You know, that they work according to kind of patterns. And really, when you start to hear what other people are experiencing in terms of their own battle with the evils that are present for them, you begin to see that the patterns aren't really too dissimilar across individuals. Now, and that happens as we begin to remove perhaps more of the idea of person, and begin to see the proprium as something that is like a construct, if you like, struggling for terms here, that is not that can take individual manifestations, but ultimately is a collective that all humanity shares. And this is the way that we can then come into an understanding of evils as a collective force. And of course, what's pointed out in the heavenly doctrine is that it is the hells in their fullness. So there is no proprium in any person that doesn't desire to rush into the deepest hell. That's a statement in the heavenly doctrine. So in that sense, we're all the same. The way that we have to combat those influences may differ, will differ from person to person. But in terms of the universal aspect of it, it all exists in all of us. But our minds are like filters that give a particular form of that in terms of our experience of it. But what we're seeking to do in logopraxis is come to see things in a more universal way. So, we emphasize the need to move away from identifying with the proprium or with the evils that are arising and calling them our own. We need to find tools by which we can draw a separation. Now, I'm responsible from whether I drink from that river or not, but it is not me, and in terms of who I am in the Lord's sight. It is me moving away from what truths teach into being caught up in the appearances of the senses that gets me identified with those evils, and so claim them as my own, or make them my own. So if I feed on them, then they take on a strong sense of being me, and that certainly at least can lead to depression in spiritual work, because if you are calling these things yourself, and then on the other hand you're looking at what it takes to enter into heaven, then you've got a problem. So truths help to draw our investment in those things into a clearer light, so that they don't have the same ground in us by which they can dominate our life.
That's fascinating, and it makes me wonder about that mental illness, which is sort of the cold killer, the person that doesn't feel any anxiety and yet causes mayhem. The other side, perhaps, or another aspect, I'm not sure. That's not really anxiety. I know that's the person without any sense of guilt, without any sense of it's my fault. It's I've got a right to take, destroy, and hurt without any sense of shame or whatever. So maybe it's a balance we have to have.
Sure. I mean, like one of the things when you do inner work is that you see that tendency is in us all. Doesn't become expressed in extreme forms through us all, but it's not something that we're immune to. That I think that's an important point. But when you see it in its extreme forms, what I would say is that that person is a slave to what's flowing in. There's no differentiation now between what's arising in terms of those states and who they feel themselves to be, and that's the tragedy of being a slave to what is of hell.
Mm-hmm. And it relates to what I referred to before, that mental health is partly to do with being warmly connected with other people. When the cold killer isn't warmly connected to anyone, isn't connected to anything very much. It's all, I'm not sure what it is, I don't quite understand, but it certainly doesn't seem that they're warmly connected with anything.
Well, I think this distinction between...
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just thinking how important communities were in the physical, sort of mirroring the spiritual, like our community of believers, the family as a community, all those physical communities to which we belong, mirror the spiritual, or the other way around.
Yeah, that's so right. So what we see on an external level are principles at work in terms of connecting in with positive communities engaged in natural good. The same principles apply at that level as they do internally. If we're in touch with what is good and true, obviously our experience of life is totally different to that, to the opposite. If what dominates is what is evil and false. So in logopraxis, what we're trying to do is come into a sense of what is good and true from a experiential perspective. Gray, you had something you wanted to.
I'm not sure whether how much time or effort to put in about this distinction between mental health as a foundation for spiritual work, but it does seem that it's imperative that a person has had, I know what it is. It was a number that I ran across that had to do with a fullness of remains, and it had to do in the story in the Bible about how the children of Israel weren't set out to fight until they were at least 20 years old. And the significance of that was that until somebody has a down-to-earth experience of the Lord's love through other human beings, that they're not allowed into the combats of temptation. And to me, I came to look at therapy as being something, mental health therapy, as something that helps people get organized so they can receive the experience of being loved and loving, and that until that foundation is there, the Lord doesn't allow a person to move into the spiritual work of temptation, because that's a kind of battleground. And that was really, really helpful to me. It was a very significant shift to recognize that sometimes in our relationships, in community, that we're being called to supply an affirmation of the personality or the person and identify it that way. And by the same token, that kind of thinking came to a certain point, and then it was like, but this isn't enough. And then logopraxis offered a whole different world beyond that, and that's where I think this sermon is talking as indirectly implying that there is a foregone assumption that mental health is a foundation, and that even if you've gone to your therapy and done your, gotten sort of more balanced, that then going into logopraxis and the things that come up there, it was very interesting to think about the distinction between, say, the depression and anxiety I had between age 14 and 35 and what I've had in my 50s and 60s through logopraxis, that it's an entirely separate kind of process. And I don't know whether it's because, all the, like, I'm not trying to lift the rock anymore, and the tool to go to what does the Lord say about this instead of how can I feel better is such a shift. I don't want to blather on too much. Sorry.
That's great. That's great. Yes, so it's about a state of maturity in terms of those remains. I think that's the point that's made. I think it's 30 years for the Israelites became a fighting age at 30. So the idea was that they were established in the more external aspects of life, which is like us, in terms of our development. As we become more and more established in terms of our own sense of what is right and wrong, if you like, and then as that builds over time and becomes a guide and director of our life, then comes a stage where that has to be reflected on. So a good example, I suppose, is where people build a historical faith, a historical sense of faith. That's an important phase and stage of life. But a historical faith is not a saving faith. It only can become a saving faith when it is examined for oneself and seen for from oneself or from one's own engagement with the Word and a new understanding that's arising more from a practice perspective as to what is useful and what is not useful in terms of those beliefs that have been built up over the course of our life up to that point where we then begin to seriously examine things. I just wanted to, Elizabeth, have you got something to say?
I was just going to say, I like the statement that the mind filters what comes in. That's how we can allow the Lord in, or allow the angels in, or allow the spirits of hell. Sort of filters them in. Look at it in a physical way, you can understand the spiritual.
Right. So it's not a case of, so this is another point, I think, which is an important point in this. It's not a case of things flowing in and taking control of our faculties. It is a case of drawing from what is presenting and taking it to ourselves. So that's where that's an aspect of this idea of freedom in spiritual things. Things present, and in that moment of presentation, we may well have the capacity to either reject it or accept it as part of what I'm going to be thinking or feeling. The other side of it is that where work is still in progress or hasn't begun, those things can be flowing in, and we are unconsciously taking them on. So there's a slight distinction that needs to be drawn there as well. Mm-hmm. The big thing about it, I think, and it's just one of the points I wanted to bring up, and I think it really does apply in a logopraxis and religious context, is what we term the merit-guilt cycle. This is an important aspect, and it links directly into anxiety and depression, and it isn't expanded on in the sermon, but it's something to keep in mind, and that is the idea that we are to make ourselves better, that religion is about making ourselves better. And so what the cycle is that we try to be good, we go along for a bit, something broadsides us, and we find that we are not good, but everything that we thought that we weren't begins to present itself, whether that's in negative emotions, whatever it happens to be, a harsh word, whatever it happens to be. And then we go back to just trying harder to be gooder. This is a early form of religious development. What it doesn't take into account is that what is it we're trying to make better? And when you begin to seriously reflect on your inner states of life, what you find is that what you're trying to make better is the proprium. And you're working in the realm of suppressing things rather than working in the realm of shunning evils. People get these things confused. And suppression of what's arising can only deal with things to a certain extent, and an illustration of that might be the story and the difference between Saul and David. What Saul represents can deal with certain aspects of the Philistine, if you like, but it cannot eradicate it. So it's like an early stage, a necessary stage of development, but David deals with what is more internal or what is more at the causal level of things. So there is a need to understand that no one can make the proprium better. And if you're in a state of trying to, then you're in a double bind, because what you're doing is you are setting yourself up to come into a realization that if you are identified with that proprium as you, then you can never make it. And to the degree that you're identified with that, you will be discouraged and enter into states of depression when the realization starts to dawn that there's just no hope. And that's a truth that the hells take hold of. There is no hope for the proprium, but what the Lord's offering us is what is from himself, and that is what he is seeking to have us move into. So depression that results in that kind of situation is really a depression that is connected in with the idea of merit, trying to merit heaven by being good. This is not what we're asked to do. What we're asked to do is to examine ourselves, see our evils, and shun them as sins. That's all we're asked to do. We're not asked to try. We're not asked to be made better. What we're being asked to do is remove what blocks the Lord's goodness from flowing. That's what we're being asked to do, and that is a more mature form of religious practice. It's not that the previous form is not valid in its place. It is, but when you start to make that transition, a lot of things can get upset within the mind. When you start to question your historical faith or what you've been taught, but haven't really truly examined for yourself, then things can start to get shaky at that point, and that's just the necessary stage of development. As in the natural world, when we begin to break from our parents and become independent and all of that, that's the illustration on a natural level of what's happening on a more internal level.
I was thinking about when you said before about the Lord being omnipresent. There's a lot of other words: omniscient, all-powerful, in a good way, omnipresent, and all those sort of words showing us that God is greater than anything we can imagine. And there's also the personal side of God, that we're personal because God is personal. And that's how we kind of can relate to him. Try to ground it. So that the Lord's love isn't an airy-fairy thing, it's grounded in earthly love. As we learn and grow to love more appropriately and better, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. The other, so just a couple of things. The time's getting on. So just a couple of things now. A couple other points that I wanted to just pull up about the multiplicity of the self. So the language of Scripture as symbol is full of images of this. Now, if we just take the idea, which logopraxis practitioners will be familiar with, the in me tool. If you apply the in me tool to any passage of Scripture, and it's all in you, then there's an aspect of multiplicity that, if you're reading the story about, Jacob and Isaac and Esau and everything around there, they're all aspects within ourselves. So, or if you're reading in the Gospels about Jesus moving through the crowd, okay, so lots of references to that word. The Greek word for that is oklos, and it means the disorganized mass, and so it has to do with the external parts of our mind. And so as as you're reading, you can see that this crowd is a crowd that is within you. It's a crowd of spirits, or a crowd of evils and falsities, goods and truths. The whole thing is happening when it's within our mind, and in terms of our psychological states. It is the crowd of voices within us, that we hear. So there's that aspect. I think one of the strongest elements in Scripture, one of the most clearest stories that deal with the idea of multiplicity, is the story of Legion, of the Lord casting out the legion. That's another clear example of a multiplicity sitting behind what presents as a single identity, if you like. So I'd encourage you, if you get a chance, just to, in the light of what we've been talking about here today, if you could read through that, that may be something well worth doing. In terms of practical affirmations that you can have in terms of your own experience, these are not too far from us, and this is the power of working with tasks to examine our inner state. So you can do this today, and this will affirm the truth of this idea of a multiplicity. You feel emotions you don't want to feel. And so you have thoughts that you don't want to have. And so if you feel things you don't want to feel, and you think things that you don't want to think, then who's thinking them? That's the question there. And a task observing this sort of stuff really can bring what's been spoken about here that may appear to be a bit abstract into something that is really quite concrete. I get up in the morning and I say to myself, I'm going to exercise today, and then I don't exercise. Who's wanting to exercise and who isn't? Or, I'm going to go to bed early. I'm going to get an early night tonight, and there I am sitting at 12:30 watching something on TV or something like that. There are countless examples of other wills at play, and these are things that we have to get a personal experience of if we're really going to ground these higher truths in something that is concrete and able to be reflected on at the level of our experience. I make a promise to do something and I don't do it, and then I castigate myself because I haven't done it. Well, who's doing the castigating, and what is the self that's being castigated? So we are constantly, in our experience, being given opportunities to see that we are actually a multiplicity. And of course, we can see it in extreme examples in dissociative disorders in terms of the mental health area. So there's plenty to confirm these things if we really want to, in terms of being able to examine or through the examination of our own mental or psychological landscape. So I just open it up now just for a final word, and then we can close off. So
the association between love and will seems very relevant to me, and I think you talked about not so much the conflict of will, but we want to get up but we stay in bed, or we want to prepare a meal but we go to fast food. But to me it's as useful to keep those two things in mind, that will and love, our love of a good meal and our love to save time, those loves are in conflict, and that's part of what it's about. If we, as Jesus said, we sell all we have for the pearl of great price, the great love is what causes us to rise above the conflict and clarify from a height what the priorities are and what our will should be.
Thanks, Dan. That's well spoken.
I think I've learned a heap today, so thanks, David. As a very new person to Logopraxis, I'm on a very steep learning curve, I think. And I was just thinking how important your the love of your family, love of your parents is the people, that you're sort of grounded in love if you are. And I'm very thankful that I did have that. and also my family now with children and grandchildren, and my husband Stan. But I'm very fortunate in that. Sort of came out, yeah, that's the practical affirmation of the Lord's love.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
I don't think I can add anything to what Stan said. That was great.
Okay, so yeah, thanks everybody for participating, and thanks for those of you who are out there viewing. It's been a pleasure to be here and to learn from people's experience. So stay tuned to your email, and I'll let you know when the next Emmaus Road is ready to go. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thank you
Thank
very
you, David.
much. Thank you, all of you.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
My pleasure.